It's all in your head. You don't look sick. Your tests are normal. It's probably anxiety. There's nothing wrong with you. Have you heard these words from physicians, family, and friends? If you're someone who has been struggling and swirling through the revolving door of healthcare to find answers about your health, or if you know someone who is going through this experience, then this podcast is for you. Welcome to the Desperate for a Diagnosis podcast with Laura Nozica. Hello, everyone. This is Laura Nozica. I'm the host of the Desperate for a Diagnosis podcast. I feel like myself and my guest today, we are kindred spirits in many, many ways. Today, I have on the show Joan DelFattore. She is a professor emerita at the University of Delaware, where her specialty area was academic freedom. Since 2016, she has been publishing about single life in the U.S., particularly with respect to healthcare equity. Her articles have appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine, the Washington Post, Psychology Today, Quartz, and the Health Psychologist, among many others. She also gave a TED Talk, Sick Well Single, Don't Die of Discrimination. Her current project is a book under contract with Yale University Press about obstacles to equitable healthcare faced by patients who live outside the traditional nuclear families or whose families do not provide all of the necessary help. And Joan, I'm so excited to have you here today because this is very personal for me too. And we'll dive into your story, but talking about singlehood in healthcare, or when you're in a healthcare situation and you're single, I think about this all the time because I'm single. I've never been married. I'm 54, still waiting for Joe Fabulous, whoever that is. I don't really know anymore, quite frankly. But I do. I wonder about these things, and I don't have children. So I do think about, well, what if I did get sick, and who would be my people, my person, not having a spouse. So this is really an interesting conversation that I'm looking forward to, Joan.
Thank you very much for having me here. I'm looking forward to it too.
I'll just kick this off by saying that it isn't just women, it's men as well. And apparently you experience this bias from the medical community being single while being diagnosed with a very serious illness. So tell us about what happened there, Joan, and what's driving you to really get this out in the open and bring a lot of highlight to it.
Sure. Back in 2011, I was diagnosed with stage 4 gallbladder cancer. The survival rate is less than 2%. The reason that I survived was because a surgeon who was then at Memorial Sloan Kettering, he's now the chair of the Department of Surgery at Penn Medicine, Ron DiMatteo, took a chance of doing surgery even though it was generally not recommended. He asked me questions about social support, but they were the right questions. Who will give you rides? Who will prepare meals? Do you have someone you could stay with if you needed to? But he never got into any kind of, indicated any sort of a problem about the fact that the support system I have, which is actually very robust, was not the traditional husband and children. I then went, after the surgery, I needed chemotherapy because when they diagnosed stage 4, there's the assumption that microscopic cancer is still circulating. So he did get clear margins, which gave me a chance. He got out all the visible cancer. So I went to the person at Sloan Kettering, who is their head person for gallbladder cancer, and she told me that there was recent research that had been published in the New England Journal of Medicine showing that a combination of gemcitabine and a platinum drug was the most effective chemotherapy they were aware of at the time. Like she said, and her implication was this is what anybody would use, anybody would notice. So she said, well, why come all the way to New York for chemo? You might as well get it closer to your home in Delaware. Well, I went to a medical oncologist in not in Delaware, near Delaware. Very well thought out. She had recommended him. And he immediately started with, you have no husband, you have no sons, you have no daughters, you have no sisters, you have no brothers. And I'm not making fun of it. That is how he said it. He went through all the immediate family relationships. And he ended with, your parents, are they living? No. And he said, then how will you manage? So I started to tell him about the cousins and the friends who had been with me after the surgery. So I had 3/4 of my liver removed, which makes you pretty sick for a while. They were very much there for me, so it was not theoretical. I knew that there were people who would be there. I couldn't even finish the sentence. He interrupted me and said very authoritatively, we'll start you inside on Tuesday. So I said, well, what about a platinum drug? And he obviously wasn't happy about that question. And he said, oh no, I wouldn't risk those side effects with someone in your situation. And as we talked, it became clear what he meant by my situation was he simply couldn't get his mind around the fact that an older woman living alone, no kids, no spouse, in his mind, that added up to, some poor lonely cat lady who has no one in her life. And I couldn't get him off that. So I went back to Sloan Kettering to Dr. Eileen O'Reilly, who is still their lead person for this type of illness. And she did the same thing that Dr. DelFattore had done. She asked about people who would give me rides, people who would bring meals if I got sick, people I could stay with if I needed to. She also knew, because I had had the surgery there, so she knew that I had had people around me through that. So she went ahead and did the appropriate chemotherapy. There was a twist on it a few years later that makes the story even a little bit more dramatic, because about 8 years after I finished chemotherapy, Dr. O'Reilly was one of she was the lead author on a study of whether certain genetic mutations make people more responsive to platinum drugs. I was not in that study, but out of curiosity, she asked me for a blood sample and for authorization to do a genetic study of the tumor, the part of the tumor that they had preserved. Turns out I do have the genetic mutations that cause platinum drugs to be far more effective than would be expected. Though if I had stayed with that first oncologist who wanted to give me just the gemcitabine, I might have had a recurrence that I did not have. The surgery changed the game, but I might have had a recurrence a year or two later from the residual cancer had I not gotten the correct chemotherapy. And you asked what made me start doing this research. What stuck in my mind was that moment when you said so authoritatively, we'll start gemcitabine on Tuesday. If I had not known that that wasn't the standard of care, I would have gone with him. I would have had no clue that he was shading it, that he was giving me something different than he would have given me if I had housed. And I couldn't get that out of my mind. So I started doing research on it, started publishing it, and that is how we ended up here.
Did you go back to that physician in terms of letting him know that you could be worse? And
what I did first, when I recovered and wanted to start researching this, I thought, I need to know if he's an outlier or if this is normal, if this is typical behavior. So I started doing research. I found, at the time I published the article in the New England Journal of Medicine, I had found 84 peer-reviewed medical articles. At this point, it's almost 200. That was back in 2019. At this point, it's almost 200. Medical articles that show three things. First, they show that if you show up with a current spouse, regardless of what kind of cancer you have, I mean, there are articles on breast cancer, prostate cancer, colon cancer, whatever. You show up with a partner, you are more likely to survive. And that's true even when they control for things like age, stage, and type of cancer, how early you presented, and so on. The second thing they show is that unmarried patients, according to the top article in this area, unmarried patients are 53% less likely to get surgery and radiotherapy than the same patient would be if widowed, divorced, never married. Third thing they show is that this is considered normal. So the literature says things routinely, like, well, it's well known that without a spouse, people have nothing to live for. They don't even want they don't even want aggressive treatment. They don't have the social support to handle it. It's well known that unmarried people can't comply with medical advice, do not follow through on medical recommendations. They don't want the aggressive treatment, and they're not going to be able to handle it. In other words, the discrepancy in treatment rates, which almost, I think it's pretty obvious, has something to do with the discrepancy in survival rates, is just a normal part of how people are, and it's basically the patient's fault for not having a spouse.
Wow.
So at that point, then I go back to him. At that point, no, because he was doing what the field did. So I thought, what I need to do is not change this one guy. That's not going to do that much good. What I need to do is publish stuff that will get some attention to the fact that this is happening broad-based. So that was why I realized, because I had been publishing since 1979. So by this time, I knew if you want people to pay attention, you have to publish in a journal whose acceptance makes a difference. You have to publish in a journal where people would say, okay, if those editors and those peer reviewers agreed with this enough to publish it, then it's something that we need to look at. So it took 2 years because I needed not only the research on what the medical articles were saying, but I also needed the research from psychology and sociology showing the truth about whether married people and unmarried people do in fact behave the way the medical articles were saying. So I wrote an article saying, this is what the medical articles are saying, and here's what extensive psychological and sociological research shows about married and unmarried patients. And the bottom line is, there is not enough difference between married and unmarried people as a group. And there's too much difference within each group as to whether they have social support, that you just can't use that as a marker for social support. So the New England Journal of Medicine published it. It did get some attention. And there are now, I just got a notice from the New England Journal of Medicine yesterday. There's another, I've asked them to notify me when the article is cited. So it's now been cited 22 times. So I'm hoping that at least we now have 22 articles out there that for the first time are acknowledging it might be physician bias that's leading to the undertreatment or contributing to the undertreatment of unmarried patients rather than the patients themselves.
Joan, there's so much, as you know, there's so much bias in healthcare as it is. You can call it patient profiling, gaslighting. I've had this conversation at length with a lot of my podcast guests, particularly patients, but I've also had the conversation with physicians as well. And I even interviewed a physician who's a retired emergency doctor, and she wrote a book about better ways of handling difficult patients, although that's not her philosophy, but she's aggregating what she has seen in healthcare from colleagues and how they manage patients in an ER, and within seconds can make decisions or split decisions or assumptions on, I'm looking at a patient who fits this particular profile, and oh, they must be looking for pain meds. They're an addict. Oh, this person is on Medicaid, so I can only provide so much treatment. I wrote an article on Medium about patient profiling because I had an issue in an emergency department myself. So there was all these assumptions that medical professionals have, and I don't know if that's a matter of is it groupthink that's driving that? Is it what they observe and they assume, oh, everyone's this way? They're making these kind of global assumptions on patients and what their situations are. So you had a quote situation, Joan, and I'm an only child as well. So I don't have siblings either, thinking down the road if something should happen. But how are you really digging into this, and where do you think the impact would be? The fact that your article's been cited and it's been in journals, where do you think that the next step is going to go? Because
I feel like you're a real crusader for this issue, and there's so many out there, but where do you think the real change will lie, and how do we chip away at this? Because I'm happy to get on the bandwagon with you and beat the tambourine for single people have people who are in our circles, and I've always told my parents too that one day I know you won't be here, so I really need to foster relationships with, whether it be cousins or friends or whomever it might be. And I have a lot of single friends who we look to each other to help each other out. So where do you think the real change can happen? Where is it going to stem from?
Well, as you indicated, making decisions based on implicit bias is common not only in medicine, it's a common human thing. So one problem that it is being addressed in some of the literature, there had been a myth in earlier years that doctors were totally neutral, that being a physician meant that you were not in any way biased about race or gender or whatever. That simply can't be true, because implicit bias there's a psychologist named Daniel Kahneman. He and another psychologist, Amos Tversky, did seminal research, did really groundbreaking research. Kahneman won the Nobel Prize for it. Tversky, unfortunately, had died before the prize was awarded. But their research left no room for doubt, and the research that has followed from them, they sparked a huge body of psychological and sociological research showing that the tendency to form implicit biases is hardwired into human nature, and is probably a good thing, because we wouldn't have time to stop and think everything through from scratch. It makes sense to categorize things so that we can get through the day. If we had to stop and make a separate decision and think something through before we put one foot out of bed, we'd never get anywhere. The problem in the medical profession has been the assumption that somehow that is blameworthy, that if a physician is found to have implicit bias, there is something wrong with that physician. No, if the physician is found to have implicit bias, that means the physician is human. Unless we're going to go to AI for all of our medicine, we're going to have that. And actually, even if we went to AI, we would have that. There was a study that came out of Harvard not too long ago showing that AI algorithms are biased because they were programmed by people who were making certain assumptions.
Or they were trained. Yeah. AI is being trained. Yes.
Or they were programmed from the literature. I mean, if you programmed AI from the medical literature that now exists about the treatment of married and unmarried cancer patients, the AI program would have the same bias because it would have been trained from the articles where that's the input.
Yep.
So one thing that I think is very helpful is to decriminalize, demystify, de-blame things that are perfectly normal. It makes more palatable for physicians, among others, to consider the possibility of implicit bias. A physician would not be hesitant, I think, to consider the possibility, maybe I'd better stop and think about this again because I'm really tired and that could be affecting my judgment. It's not considered blameworthy to say my judgment might be affected because I've been up a long time, I'm tired. It's also not blameworthy to say, okay, I was just about to give a less aggressive treatment to the single person because I'm assuming that they don't have social support. Wait a minute, maybe I'd better check that. That might be a bias. So one recommendation I'm making in the relevant chapter of the book I'm writing is that whenever a medical author explains their research results in terms of, well, that's just how that group is, but the implied or the expected behavior of that group, to stop and ask the question, how do I know that? How do I know? You gave the example of drug seeking, and that can happen. There's research showing that happens particularly with people of African descent, that when someone comes in who is Black, are more likely to be assumed to be drug seeking than a comparable person who is white. In the research, if medical authors determine that Black patients are less likely to receive painkillers, say OxyContin, Black patients are less likely to receive OxyContin than white patients. Okay, fine. That's what the data show. Okay. But now we come to the interpretation. If the medical author is inclined to interpret that by saying, well, part of it is because they're more likely to be drug seeking and therefore the physicians tend not to prescribe it, that's the point when the red flag needs to go up. Wait a minute, how do I know that? Just the way you would admit that you might be less than 100% accurate because you're tired. Wait a minute, how did I know that? And that got us into a whole other part of the research I'm doing, which is the medical literature is just terrible in terms of the sources, the use of sources that allegedly support statements that in fact are not true.
Joan, I'm curious about lots of things as a market researcher myself, but a couple points. So recently I had conducted a webinar about medical gaslighting and the findings from my podcast guests. And a lot of those insights are from my patient guests. But I gave several physicians an opportunity to speak about medical gaslighting and explaining what's going on the other side, give them the chance to counterpoint what the patients were saying. And to your point about burnout, there's a lot of factors that physicians don't spend enough time with patients, and at least the time that patients would like them to spend with them and really listening versus charting and all those other things that doctors need to do. But from burnout and again needing to chart everything for the paperwork, they're medical groups and they have to adhere to the 12 minutes that they get with a patient, if that. The RVUs or those productivity measurements that they need to achieve as physicians working for bigger medical groups. So there's a lot of factors that patients don't realize, but probably don't really care about, because patients we just need what we need. So that's one thing. But given the fact that there's the younger generations now are really opting to not be married. So I feel like at some point, this thinking, this dynamic is going to maybe change at some point, that doctors and maybe younger physicians who are also of those generations who are maybe choosing not to be married as well might eventually think about what we're talking about here differently. Maybe they won't have that implicit bias that, okay, I'm of this millennial generation or the Gen Zs, and they're not choosing marriage. They have kind of their tribe of friends and their people, but marriage is not on the radar so much, as I understand, for the younger generation. So what's your perspective there?
Yeah, to the point you just made, there's a recent study by the Pew Foundation showing that fewer than half of the currently single people are actively seeking partners, and only 14% have as their goal a committed long-term relationship, such as marriage. I think personal experience probably plays a role. I'm not sure it's entirely generational. For example, the surgeon and the medical oncologist at Sloan Kettering, who both asked the right questions, neither of whom was prejudiced about my not being married. They were both, I would say, in their 40s at the time, and that was 14 years ago. So it probably does have to do with your own background, but also there's a very strong element in the research showing that even when people themselves belong to a disadvantaged group, they sometimes still absorb the beliefs about that group that they pick up from the ambient culture. So, for example, there's been some very interesting research recently on unmarried adults showing that women, the research happens to have been done on women, it also needs to be done on men, but when they get into maybe 30s, 40s, 50s, there's a huge difference in terms of their perceived happiness as to whether they want a partner or not. it seems like duh, but it's actually a revolutionary finding because we used to believe in our culture that every single person wants a romantic partner without exception, unless you're a priest or a nun or something like that. Everybody wants a romantic partner. So the research showing that unmarried people differ in whether they want a partner. And the ones who don't want a partner tend to be very satisfied with being single. That led to research, why do people who don't have a partner want a partner? Well, sometimes it's because, like probably the majority of people, they genuinely want a partner. But there's a subset of single people who are unhappy that they don't have a partner because everybody is telling them they should have a partner. But if that weren't there, they'd be perfectly happy the way they are now. They feel as if they're being relegated to second-class status, and they don't like that. And they see getting a partner as a way out of that. But that's not the same thing as intrinsically really wanting a partner because you really want a partner. So I think you started off this question with, would there be changes over time? I think one way to make a change over time, which also has been validated by research, when people become aware of the possibility of a bias, they are much more likely to stop and think about it. So the research in medicine has been done so far with men and with gender and with racism. And when medical professionals are made aware of their own, of the possibility, no fault, no judgment, just you've grown up in a culture where you have been inundated with stereotypes. You're not immune to that. Going to medical school doesn't make you something other than a human. So once they become aware that they might be influenced by something like patient's race or sex, they are much less likely then to treat people differently afterward because they do stop and think. In the case of married people, wait a minute, I'm just assuming that this woman has all the support she needs because she has a husband. Maybe I better double check. Because maybe the husband works out of town. He's never here. Maybe he's just a jerk. Maybe I better double check and make sure she has the support I assume she has. Or that it's coming from the husband. Maybe she depends on her best friend, not on her husband for the things that I'm assuming the husband is going to do. And you spoke about the time element. And I'm also getting into this in my book. Obviously, I've heard from a number of physicians, well, we don't have time to get into this. There are two answers to that. First, if somebody showed up, let's say, with they have excessive thirst and they are tired all the time and they have frequent urination, all of this suggests diabetes. But no physician would just give them diabetes medication without testing because they don't have time and busy. Well, if your belief about a patient's situation is going to influence the treatment you give them, you have to be right in that belief because the impact on the patient is the same. So if somebody undertreats a cancer patient because they think she has diabetes when she doesn't, or they think she has a lack of social support when she actually has social support, the effect of the undertreatment on the patient is going to be the same regardless of what the reason was. So you can't just say, I don't have time to check social support, if social support is a critical factor in the decision you're going to make about how you treat that patient. But there are ways around it because, for instance, many medical practices now routinely screen for depression. They give you a form to fill out before you see the doctor where you check all the little boxes about whether you're depressed. They do the same thing with what is your prior medical history? Is there anybody in your home who's abusing you? They do all of these things by people filling out forms ahead of time. And then if there's any kind of a red flag, a nurse or a nurse practitioner or a physician assistant talks to you about it and then gives the necessary information to the physician. It would not be that big an imposition to add 2 or 3 questions about social support. Not do you have a husband or children, but if you need rides, do you have rides? If you need someone to stay with you, do you have someone to stay with you? Simply add that to the other information that's collected already.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I'm totally tracking with you, Joan, because I have done market research on cancer treatments and talking through some treatments that, as you know, could be more arduous than others. And the doctors in my research have been asked, how would you approach this patient based on profile? And maybe it includes, maybe they're older, have some comorbidities, they live 2 hours from a major academic center, let's say, that does more advanced treatment for cancer. And I've presented these profiles to these physicians and I've asked them, of all the treatments that are available, how would you approach this patient's plan? And they would say, oh, well, they're older, and they got some comorbidities, not really sure how, quote, motivated they are. So, how determined are you to live, I think is basically where they're getting. And knowing that they're 2 hours away and maybe don't have support from a son because he lives out of town and the husband is somewhat sickly and not able to drive. And at that point, they are making suggestions in this research that they would approach the patient with a potentially less efficacious treatment. So very much to your point, this is how physicians are thinking.
Well, and there's also a tendency, you may be familiar with the mental shortcut called confirmation bias, where people tend to pay attention to information that supports what they already believed. And they are basically almost immune to information that contradicts what they already believed. They ignore it, they underplay it, they simply don't take it into account. That plays into what you were just talking about with regard to whether unmarried patients want treatment. It is a given in the medical literature. It is stated as a fact, as if it were handed down from a mountain on stone tablets. Without a spouse, patients are less likely to want aggressive treatment. Well, a team of researchers from top institutions, it was led by people from Harvard, it was Mayo Clinic, Dana-Farber, so top-level researchers, used the best database, which is maintained by the National Cancer Institute. The National Cancer Institute maintains a database that has the records of almost 10 million patients who were treated for cancer in the United States. And you can cross-reference it by age, stage of cancer, type of cancer, rural or urban living, marital status, what treatment did they receive, what was recommended, and so on. Well, this team of researchers wanted to know, are there factors that contribute to a patient not wanting aggressive treatment? So it was, the title of the article was something to the effect, refusal of surgery and radiotherapy by cancer patients. So they looked at the records of almost 1 million patients, a huge sample size. They looked at the records of almost 1 million patients with regard to a lot of different factors, age, place of residence, and so on. Well, one of the factors was marital status. And they predicted, the authors predicted, that married patients would be more likely to accept surgery and radiotherapy than unmarried patients. What they found was that 99.48% of unmarried patients accepted surgery when it was offered, and 98.33% accepted radiotherapy when it was offered. These were the same authors who had been saying in previous articles that unmarried patients don't want aggressive treatment. In this article, the married patients were they were 0.25% higher on surgery and 0.33% higher on radiotherapy, which confirmed the previous belief of the authors. All the authors said, the only thing they said about their results with regard to unmarried patients was, well, see, that shows that the support of a spouse makes people more willing to have treatment. 99.48% accepted treatment, and they're still interpreting that to suggest if the patient's not married, they're less likely to want treatment.
Oh, wow. So, boy, Joan, I think your research will blow any research that has been done out of the water when you're
I should mention in the responses to I put that in the New England Journal of Medicine article. And in the responses to it, there were a lot of things written about it at the time in various publications. And that example was picked up a lot, more than almost anything else. But what you were saying before, though, about the profiling, the bottom line is you need to ask. I mean, if I were, it's not hypothetical. The best treatment I could get was at Sloan Kettering, which is 2 hours away from my home. And I was, by golly, on that train to Sloan Kettering. So you really need to find out what the person's determination is. You can't just assume, oh, well, she's single, she doesn't have a husband or kids. She probably doesn't want this treatment. Oh, yes, I do.
Right. But it sounds like it took you to do the research to know what treatments were available, what the range of treatments were, for you to ask, why am I not getting this platinum-based chemotherapy?
Also, I had been told it by an authoritative source, but the medical oncologist at Sloan Kettering did not simply say that this is what she would use. She made it clear this is what, in her opinion, anybody should use. Without that, I might not have known.
Yeah.
And what happens if a single person, what would have happened to a single person if that one that I went to were the first one I went to and they didn't know any better? One very strong suggestion for anybody in any circumstance, if your life depends on it, get a second opinion.
100%. Yes, I agree. I've done that with things that are considered way more benign than cancer. I had some issues with tinnitus, with ear ringing, and it took me 3 ENTs to finally get an answer and resolution. I had one who said there's nothing you can do about it. I had another one say your hearing's fine, you don't have any pressure issues. My primary had me do an MRI of my brain. Another ENT had me do a CT of my sinuses. And finally, ENT number 3 said, I know what's going on. You have pressure in your ears. It's causing all kinds of inflammation with the nerves that, all of that. Everything's all connected. She put me on steroids for a few weeks and nasal sprays, and it's gone. I mean, something as simple as ear ringing, as compared to something like cancer, yes, 100%. If it's a second or a third opinion, you gotta go. You have to understand that the options that you are being presented by physician A is what physician B and C would recommend for you as well. And so much of my podcast conversations are about advocacy. And so what would you say, Joan, to a single person who was in your situation? Because I have a friend who, she's a physician. She's beautiful. She was recently diagnosed with breast cancer. She's single, no children, and by gosh, she's very motivated to be adherent to her treatment. So what do you suggest to single people?
I'm actually making a couple of suggestions. One of them was in that TEDx talk that I know you mentioned you had listened to. Well, when I was doing the research for an article that I published in the Washington Post, I interviewed 3 social workers at major institutions. One at Mayo Clinic, one was a local one, and one at Sloan Kettering. And I asked them just the question you just asked. What suggestions would you make? Now, they were thinking in terms of inpatients. They said, go to a patient advocate or to a social, if you're being admitted to the hospital, to a patient advocate or to a social worker and say, she said, we know that this is an issue. Just say, look, I don't have a traditional support system, but I have a very strong support system. And I'm worried that I'm going to get profiled because I don't have a husband and I don't have kids. And they're going to think a whole bunch of things that come from the way people without husbands and children are portrayed in our society. So what do I do about this? Another possibility, though, even in a doctor's office, would be to get out in front. So, for instance, if you're going in for something that may be serious, if you choose to do this, You could bring someone with you. It's simply a visual aid. Here's this person in the room who cares about me. Also, to get out in front of it. So if I had it to do again, now that I know this, if I were going in, fortunately, I'm very happy to say since then I haven't had that problem. No, I'm sorry, I did. I had a tear duct blockage, which is, compared with gallbladder cancer, is not a big deal. Required surgery and an overnight. I went over to Penn Medicine for this. And in that instance, I did get out in front of it, which is what I would recommend that people do before, when it had been diagnosed as a blockage that was going to need surgery to open it because nothing else was working. Before the surgeon could even start talking about kind of treatment or whatever, I would say, if you let me know what kind of support I'm going to need, I do have a number of friends and cousins who will be, who will be doing this. That, by the way, is another thing that I recommend that single people do. Well, I was just talking about this last night with a group of people who include singles. There's a tendency in medical centers, I think they do this because they don't want to confuse patients and they don't want to have the same conversation more than once. So they wait till the screaming last minute to tell you what you're going to need. So when I had that eye surgery, the tear duct opening surgery, when I was about to be discharged, they said, now you need this, that, and the other thing from the pharmacy. You could have told me that last week. I could have picked it up. Don't assume everybody has a spouse who can get in the car and go get it for them.
Yeah.
Yeah. So 2 things. First, say up front what your social support is. And second, ask up front. I don't have a spouse to go out and get stuff for me. What supplies am I going to need? What am I going to need to have set up beforehand? Don't wait till I'm incapacitated and then I have to rely on someone else where I could have done it myself.
Yeah. And just to highlight to Joan, it's not people who, for whatever reason, they're single, never been married, etc. But there are people who are widowed and they're widowers, and maybe they do have children, but they live out of state potentially. So they're technically single. If, like I said, if they're widowed, of course, divorced, etc. So there's all these different single situations or single circumstances, and it's not just I choose to not be with someone, but the perception seems the same regardless of reasons why you are single.
I think you're right. I think, though, that it also applies to exactly what you just said, also applies to couples, because there are assumptions made about what it means to have that romantic partner that may not be played out. So you were talking about someone who's maybe widowed, maybe the children live at a distance, but maybe they're part of a church where the minute you say you need something, the church people are all over it. Or in my case, I belong to a Rotary Club, where if I were to send an email saying, guys, I need rides to Philadelphia for such and such, there'd be a line. So just as you can't assume it with single people, you can't assume it with married people. To turn your example the other way around, suppose that it were a woman who shows up with her husband and they live together and they seem to get along very well. Okay, but what the doctor doesn't know is he works out of town all week. Or he's about to be sent to some other country for a month. Or he's showing up and making nice in front of the doctor. But when they get home, he's going to be no use at all. You don't know that. That's why I'm suggesting something like a neutral, non-judgmental, short questionnaire. Who would give you rides? Who would prepare meals, etc. Maybe the person the doctor should be talking to isn't the spouse, but the sister of the person or the neighbor of the person.
I've had, so again, I'm 54. So as far as children's concerned, that ship has sailed. But I used to, when I was younger, I would have people ask me, "So when are you getting married?"
Oh, yeah.
And you're an only child, and so you need to have kids because who's going to take care of you when you get older? And I thought, well, I'm not going to give birth just so I can guarantee myself a caregiver as I get older, because I hear from friends all the time who now have older children who are out living their life, doing their thing, and they don't live nearby, and they actually a lot of times have to uproot their lives where they are and come back home and help their parents, or sometimes they don't. So there's no guarantee that anyone will help you. You just can't assume that, yes, that a spouse is going to be really good at being a caregiver, because some people can't really handle that very well, or they don't want to be in a position where they're having to give support in that kind of way. Some people, depending on the circumstances, husbands helping their wives use the bathroom or bathing or whatever. That's just, some people just can't do it. And so you can't really rely on those, on spouses, etc.
Well, and sometimes it's the other way around. My father was 6'2" and weighed maybe 200 pounds, and my mother was 4'9" and probably didn't weigh 100. So when he was ill after a heart attack, with all the goodwill in the world, she couldn't handle him. She was just not physically able to handle him. So I had to get third-party help, and I couldn't either. I'm 5 feet flat. I couldn't lift a man that size. With regard to this spousal thing, now you were talking about not having children to take care of you. There's also a myth. Why don't you need to get married so you have someone when you're aging, so you have someone to take care of you. What are you going to do when you're old and sick,
Right.
if you don't get married? But if you think about it, first of all, it's relatively rare for both spouses to die at the same time. Even if the marriage is still going at the time that you're old, one of you is probably going to die before the other one. And the research very clearly shows that widowed people tend to do worse than never married people because they don't have an infrastructure and they don't have the psychological attitude that it's okay to turn to other people. I had a good friend who had been married more than 50 years. Her husband died. A few years later, she and 3 other friends and I were at an event at the governor's house in Dover, Delaware. And this friend was approaching the door when the door swung open, knocked her sideways, and she fell into a flower pot. She was at the time about 77, 78, or a little older, almost 80. She was complaining of pain, and this lady did not complain of pain. So I went with her to the emergency room. It was hilarious because the governor sent us in his SUV with his armed driver.
VIP.
Absolutely. So we got to the emergency room. I stayed with her at the emergency room. Another one of our friends went to her home to get the things that she would need overnight. The next day, another one of our friends, who is a retired judge, was in the room with her when the surgeon came in, and the retired judge knew the questions to ask, so she was there. But the reason this is relevant is that when our friend then was in rehab, and we were visiting every day. Her daughter did come.
Mhm.
We were visiting every day. The daughter needed to go back to her job in Washington. And our friend said to us afterward, when my husband died, I thought I didn't have anyone. I thought if anything like this happened, I would be alone. She was so surprised because she had been so acclimated. And this is an outgoing, intelligent woman. She was actually a major political figure in Delaware. But she had absorbed what our culture tells us, that the spouse is supposed to be one-stop shopping. The spouse is supposed to be everything to you, which is not healthy. It really, she had done the right thing in that she had made friends like us all along. She didn't realize it, but she had a Plan B support system. But it took that experience to make her recognize that she still had support without the spouse.
And And this could be an entirely other conversation, Joan. And I think about my mom at this point, because I mentioned to you that my dad passed away in January of 23. So it's coming up on 2 years. And she had taken care of him. He had congestive heart failure and diabetes, and he wasn't a big guy or anything like that. He was my stepdad since I was 11. But his family, the men in his family, just had really crummy hearts, and a lot of genetics went against him. And he had just retired before he passed away. But my mother was doing so much for him. I do think that had she not been doing all that she'd been doing, because then it was the cooking, because he had diabetes and he had CHF. So it's this fine balance of watching carbs and salt, and how do you cook for that? And I think he would have, he lived over 10 years since his diagnosis. And I think had she not been there, he probably would have passed a lot sooner. So now she's in a situation where she lives down the block from me, and she's very healthy at 75. We just got her a new car, 2025, so she's good. But things will happen at some point. And I do tell her she has some girlfriends, but again, they're older. I said, but it's really important for you, and she's very social, to build and foster relationships maybe with other people in different venues. Like you said, you're involved in Rotary and whatnot. And I don't think that, and I think regardless of being married or single, whatever, that it's so important to foster relationships outside of your main relationship, your whatever you're in, your marriage or living arrangement or whatever people are doing these days, because you just never know when you are going to end up without that person that you have anchored so much of your life to. And it's just so important to, again, build relationships outside of your little bubble at home, whatever it might be.
For me personally, it's important that the relationships are reciprocal. So the people I would turn to if I were sick are people who are part of my life, and we do things for each other. So for instance, when I had cataract surgery, the friend who drove me is somebody I used to team teach with at the University of Delaware. Well, right around that same time, her mother, who lived in a different country, her mother became suddenly very ill. So my friend had to drop everything and run. So I filled in. I could teach her courses because we had team taught. I knew what she was doing. So I filled in for her. Or I would. I'm a member at a DuPont estate that's nearby. So I'll take her to events there. So and then she got up early, and she is not a morning person. She got up early to take me for cataract surgery both times, which I very much appreciated. But the thing is, we have dinner together. We do things together. We actually had dinner just a couple nights ago. So it's people that are really in your life. I think a mistake I see sometimes on Facebook on the Community of Single People webpage, where it's more than 7,000 people now that are part of the community of single people. It was started by Bella DiPaolo, who was the pioneering psychologist who did research on single life. She very recently published a book called Single at Heart, about people who want to be single, saying, you know what, this is not as rare as you would think from the culture. But on that Facebook page, people say things like, how do I find someone to take me here or to do this or that? And I'm thinking, I never say this, but I'm thinking, no, the question is, let's talk about what constitutes a healthy single life. It's fine if you're looking for a partner. That there's no reason you shouldn't be looking for a partner if you want one. But even if you found a partner, you would still want to have a social support system. You would still want to have other people you can talk to, people you can go do things with. The partner might not necessarily share all of your interests. Maybe you love opera and your partner isn't going to love opera. So you need other people who go to operas with you. So the question to me is not at the last minute when you're now sick, who do you get to take care of you? The thing is, could we plan our lives better from the beginning, not being so laser focused as our culture encourages us to be on finding the one, the other, but rather thinking about a healthy social life that may include for some people a romantic partner, but doesn't consist of a romantic partner.
Yeah, yeah. And again, whether you're divorced or widowed, etc. Yeah, Joan, I think that's a great way to think about it, because I think we can agree that we get different things from different people. We can't just get everything from one person. And again, in the case of my mom, of course I would be there for her if something happened, but I still have to work and make a living. She took care of my grandma. My grandma passed away at 96. My great grandma passed away at 104. And they both lost their husbands fairly young. My great grandmother, she was 20 years than her husband. And he had passed away, I think maybe in his 50s even. And my grandfather died the day before his 60th birthday. So both of them were very young, losing their spouses. They never remarried, but they had children and a lot of siblings and all of that. Then my mom had to take care of my grandmother as she was failing, and my grandma never worked. And my mom didn't. I still have to work. I don't have that fallback person. My mom had my stepdad as her fallback person, making money and whatever, and she could go help grandma whenever she wanted to. So I think to have that understanding as to who do I trust, who is available, who would be there for me regardless, I really do think you have to have those conversations when you are finding yourself in a different situation, or even before that it even happens.
Well, and not even aiming the relationships necessarily at this is someone I could call if I needed, a ride to a doctor's appointment, but it enriches life. Now, people differ in how much socialization they want, which is a whole other thing. When you look at the happiness scales that are used in psychology, they're very extrovert oriented. So, for instance, I was doing one just for the fun of it, and I had the scoring thing that showed me how the questions were rated, and there was one: would you rather go out to a party or stay home and read a book? And you were rated as happier if you said you wanted to go to the party. Well, that's just majoritarian bullying. There's no basis for that. Certainly, the argument, I actually had an argument with a psychologist about this, a psychological researcher, who said, well, but, if people are totally socially isolated and they have no one, and that way of much research showing how bad that is. Yeah, but the fact that they'd rather stay home and read a book than go to a party doesn't mean they're socially isolated. Maybe they have good friends they have lunch with and they have deep conversations. They just don't like a party scene. The person in the party scene is totally shallow, has nobody in their life. They go to the party to get drunk. So it's really a value judgment that going to the party means you're happy and staying home with a book means you're not. So I recognize that people are different in terms of how much socialization they want. There's a small amount of research beginning to emerge about people who identify the way I would identify myself as hybrid. So I'm very happy staying home by myself, working on my book, writing my book. I decided when I was 70 to learn Italian because I always wanted to speak Italian. So now I can speak Italian fairly well. So I need time to do those things. So being by myself doesn't mean being lonely or sad. I'm part of a community. They just don't happen to be in the room right now. So I'm doing, and these other things are not a replacement or a substitute. It's something else in my life that's very enriching. But then tonight, for instance, I am going to a party, which I'm going to very willingly. It's the women's group, the International Women's Forum, has a Delaware branch. I am on the board of it. So I'm very happily going to that. Yesterday, I had lunch with my friends, those same friends who took care of the lady who fell in the flower pot. So I enjoyed both. When I'm at the party, I enjoy the party, and I know beforehand I'm going to enjoy it. But then the next day I'm going to be here the whole day alone. I'm not going out. I have one Zoom. Other than that, I'm here. And that's fine too. So allowing for that variation, you still need to encourage people to have some people in their lives. Somebody, and even if it's not something where you're going to parties or you're doing that kind of thing, a balance is, I think, what we're striving for.
Yeah. Yeah. We don't always have to be hanging from the chandeliers and dancing on the tables, right? Even though that does sound like a good time. And I think that goes back to also when doctors say, and again, these are doctors that I've interviewed who I've asked, well, how would you approach this patient in terms of their treatment based on their history and their current home situation, et cetera? And then they say, well, it's borderline this treatment versus that treatment. And it depends on how motivated they are. I think to have these other things going on in your life, if you're in that age range where you can do that, then you need to have things to live for and keep you going.
This is true.
Yeah. But Joan, if we had just like a couple minutes to do some girl chat, boy, after 50, as far as looking for a partner, I just kind of said, whatever. And I have all these other things going on to your point, it's not necessarily a priority. And, I'll just speak from a woman's point of view. I have plenty to keep me busy. I am never bored. I have my business. I have my podcast. I dance for a hobby, ballroom, and some other social dances, which people always ask me, don't you meet people? Don't you meet guys while you're dancing? And I say, well, of course I do. I try not to date within the dance community because even though I spend a lot of my social time there, I don't want to screw it up either by having potential exes walking around. I don't need to be uncomfortable, but my thing is always, this is what I'll say. Why make one man miserable when I can make 10 happy? I have all these dudes that I can dance with, and we all go home. But what's interesting, to your point about levels of interaction that people, whatever your tolerance is for interaction with people, because some people are energized by other people, some people are exhausted by people. And I know that there's men in particular who are engineers or chemists, and they are more introverted, if you will, professions, and fit them personality wise, that are in my dance community. And so for them, an evening of dancing with somebody for 2.5 minutes to one song, and then they move on to the next person, for a lot of them, that's all the social interaction they need or want. And that's okay. So again, deciding on what works best for you and what energizes you versus what exhausts you. Everyone is different in terms of what drives them in their social circle.
Another researcher I know, his name is Eliakim Kislov. He's an Israeli researcher. He's a sociologist at in Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He did some research recently, was recently published, showing that people who are not married seem to derive greater benefit from a smaller amount of social interaction. In other words, an amount of social interaction that would be found unsatisfactory by some people. Those who are not married are more likely to find that that's enough.
Mm-hmm.
That does it for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of times though, I was born to be single only because of the fact that I have this lineage of very strong women who did lose husbands early in their lives and had to figure it out as single mothers. And my mom's the same way. Natural father left when I was very young, and she had to figure it out. And then my stepdad came along, thank goodness. But I had good examples from that standpoint. And not everybody can be alone. They don't know how to do it. So, and I don't know that there's a master class on on how to be single. Maybe we should start it, Joan. Maybe that's something we could do.
And I think the big thing is not the non-judgmental element of it. To recognize different people have different needs. This whole problem was started by the one-size-fits-all stereotype. It developed historically for reasons that, in order for the farm to work, you needed the husband and the wife and you needed the kids. So the idea of patriarchal marriage as the bedrock of society, there was a time when it would have been hard for things to function otherwise, but that time is now past.
Right.
So I think we need to be more open to the reality that not everyone wants a spouse and children, either or. And that's okay. So we have friends who are married, we have friends who are not married. I think those of us who figured out that we didn't want to be married before we got married probably are in better shape than some others are.
Yeah. Yeah. And hopefully this kind of reaction that you get from people, particularly for women, oh, you've never been married. This kind of I feel sorry for you kind of thing. Hopefully that will go by the wayside soon enough. But real quick, Joan, before we wrap up, and just to circle back to our earlier conversations about the articles that you've written and that have been in the journals, I'm curious about what reactions you've had from the medical community.
From medical researchers, backing up if you define the medical community as including medical news outlets, podcasts and newsletters on medical issues, it got quite a bit of coverage there. And it also got coverage in psychological sources. So I was invited to write that story for the health psychologist, actually 2 articles for the health psychologist and so on. The reaction that's most important, I think, I was also on NPR, which was helpful because that got some attention. The reaction that was most important, though, I think, is the articles that cite it now. So you have an article that shows that unmarried people are undertreated relative to married people. In the discussion section, which previously was nothing but it's because of the way single people are. Now, at least those articles are saying, but there's a possibility it might be the physician's bias. And I think we need at least to insert that possibility into the medical literature to break the stranglehold of the old belief that just gets repeated from one article to the next without validation. There's no substance to it. There's no foundation to it. There's no research foundation to it. It's just a personal opinion of physicians that's been cited in these articles from the beginning. First one I could find was published in 1987. That attitude, if you're not married, you don't want treatment and you don't have social support, they keep quoting each other without realizing that none of them ever actually proved that that was true. So this is why I am writing the book I'm writing now, because I'm hoping it is coming out of Yale University Press. I'm hoping it will get some attention. It also will have, besides what we've been talking about, it will also have several chapters on ways in which the medical system could be more user-friendly and equitable for patients whose social support systems are not traditional. We've already talked about one. You can't give people the information they need at the last minute when they're already in for a procedure. You need to tell them ahead of time what they need. So things as simple as that. And also the literature that you find in a number of medical centers. You and your family, we include the family. Some people's caregivers are not family.
Yeah.
And it's no good saying, well, we allow you to define family. No, that's like saying that using he and him and his also includes women. No, you have to say family and friends. You have to say loved ones. You have to say caregivers. You can't say family and that the rest of you are just subsumed under that. No, we're not.
Yeah. There's so much focus on family, even in, political rhetoric, etc. I know we could go on and talk about that forever too. Everything's about the family, but I think it's been recognized for so long too that, as you say, the nuclear family is just not the typical. It's not the norm anymore. There's all different kinds of families, as we heard on Sesame Street and wherever else we've heard these things. But Joan, I want to thank you so much for your wisdom and your insight and giving us the hard facts of what's going on out there. There's so much bias in healthcare as it is, and now we're drilling even deeper from a marital status standpoint. So I want to thank you for everything today. And how can folks find you? Where do you want to direct them as far as websites and books? And when will your book be available?
The manuscript is due in October, so assuming that I make the deadline, it typically takes about 9 months to a year.
Okay.
You submit a book for the book to come out. I can be found, I'm on Facebook as Joan DelFattore, so the way my name would be spelled on your podcast. That's probably the best way to find me. And also, if people are interested, the Community of Single People Facebook page is something that people might want to join. Very importantly, it is not about dating. It's nothing about dating. It's about how you live productively as a single person. And some people in that group are looking for a partner, but trying to live their best life as a single person till they find a partner. Many people in that group are lifelong singles deliberately.
Well, very good, Joan DelFattore or DelFattore,
Yes.
however you prefer. Thank you again for being here and enlightening all of us. This is Laura Nozica, host of the Desperate for a Diagnosis podcast. Be well, everyone, and keep pushing for answers.
Oh my goodness, that's a wrap on another compelling story. Thanks for listening to the Desperate for a Diagnosis podcast. If you would like more information about today's guests or to find out more about Laura, go to desperateforadiagnosis.com. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also follow show updates and healthcare news on the podcast's Facebook page. If you would like to be a guest on the show, or if you have any questions, advice, or suggestions for our guests, please email me at lauramarie@desperateforadiagnosis.com. Please note, I am not a medical professional, nor am I affiliated with any healthcare, pharmaceutical, or device company. I am an entrepreneur and an independent market researcher focused on helping healthcare organizations better understand the patient perspective. The podcast is not meant to offer medical advice, but to merely share the stories and perspectives of podcast guests.